All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our last lecture of Unit 6. As a reminder, Unit 6 is all about imperialism. It's also known as the consequences of industrialization. Now, we're actually going to have another lesson after this. There's no lecture associated with that particular lesson, as it's just connecting Unit 6 and Unit 7 together. And will act as a guide to our next unit. And I'll talk about that more when we actually get to class. But this here is the last lecture itself that you guys need to watch. Today, we're going to be looking at immigration and the responses to immigration, something I've been talking about a lot over the last couple of units, but now we're really going to take a deep look at it today. So we're just focused on question number 3. What were the causes of migration and how did societies receiving migrants respond during this time period? So make sure you are looking for causes and responses, and I'll make sure to point those things out as we go along. Let's go ahead and get started here. So the first thing we want to address are the reasons why people are leaving their countries. I'm going to start with the Europeans, and then we'll talk about the responses, and then I'll actually go ahead and talk about the Chinese as well, just to at least give you an idea of what I'll be looking at today. So we've actually talked about these push and pull factors before when we looked at Unit 5. We were talking about industrialization and how many European immigrants came over to the United States. Well, those are the same exact factors. We still have the Irish potato famine that impacted not only Ireland, but all of Europe and the revolutions of 1848. So there are many immigrants, whether they are Irish, whether they are British or French or Czech or Slovak or any of the European descent. Many are coming over for these reasons here. The big pull factors, there are jobs in the United States, specifically in the factories in the major cities. That's what we talked about when we looked at Unit 5. And many of these workers are going to live in urban areas and create their own ethnic neighborhoods. I'm not sure if I talked about this before, but where I'm from in Detroit, there are still these ethnic neighborhoods. We had Corktown, in which many people from Cork County in Ireland came over and happened to settle there. We had Mexican Town, which was home to many Mexican immigrants. We had Greek Town, which is home to many Greek immigrants. And this is true not only in Detroit, but all of these major cities, as many Europeans and immigrants from all over the world came into these urban areas because of the jobs and set up their own ethnic neighborhoods. You'll talk about that more when you look at AP US history next year. But let's go ahead and talk about the response by the United States. The response by the United States is to limit the amount of immigration. Let's go ahead and go over a couple of the details first, like a couple of the actual laws put into place, and then we'll talk about why they decided to put in those laws. The first law was the Immigration Act of 1921, or the Emergency Quota Act. The idea was to restrict undesirables by establishing a quota. So this quota was based on the 1910 census. And this quota limited down to 3%, as you see here from any country. So, for example, let's say there were 100 Czechs living in the United States according to the 1910 census. Obviously, there was way more than that, but for simplicity's sake, only the United States could only allow a 3% growth from Czechoslovakia per year. So only 3 more people from Czechoslovakia could come into the United States every single year. If that, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. The Immigration Act of 1924, just a few years later, restricted it even more. It then became 2% based on the 1890 census. So it made it even more difficult for immigrants to come to the United States. There was this idea here, and this is a very famous phrase, no Irish need apply. And this would be applied to other ethnicities as well. No Slovaks, no Czechs need apply. What that exactly means is that these jobs, and whether they are mom and pop shops or whether they are large businesses, said, hey, if you're Irish, don't bother applying because we're not going to hire you. We see you as undesirable. Let's talk about that. Why are they undesirable? Well, many of these immigrants, especially coming from Southeast Europe, are seen as undesirable because they're coming from unindustrialized countries. Remember, Britain was highly industrialized. Even France was highly industrialized as well. So those immigrants were welcomed with open arms. If you were from Britain or from France, mostly people accepted you in the United States. But if you're coming from Italy, if you're coming from Czechoslovakia, you haven't necessarily had an industrialized society for as long as the British did. And you definitely don't have an industrialized society like the United States has. So you're not used to this idea of going to work and working in the factory. But even more than that, during this time period, the United States has taken off with education and set up mandatory schooling. Well, that isn't true for other countries in Southeast Europe who are far away from the British and therefore far away from industrialization. So they don't necessarily have the education. Many of these individuals also don't speak English. Which obviously is going to make it very difficult for them to get work. And it's very difficult for them to understand democracy. If you're going to have a good democratic society, you have to understand how to participate in that democratic society. Many immigrants coming from Southeast Europe were still used to being under the thumb or under the rule of a monarch, similar to how Russia was under the rule of a czar. So we see that for those reasons, these people are seen as undesirable and they are seen as destroying American culture. We want to keep those things in mind because those terms have been used in the modern day to justify limits on immigration. And so this we should be able to see a very clear connection between what we're learning in class during this time period, about 100 years ago in the early 1900s, and our own modern day. Let's go ahead and move on to Chinese migration. So we talked about European immigration coming to the eastern part of the United States. Chinese migration, the push factors are the economy under the Qing dynasty. We said that there were the Opium Wars, and following the Opium Wars, there was the Taiping Rebellion. All of these wars are obviously going to push people out of China. It's destroying the economy. There's a whole lot of violence. There's very good reason to leave. Why are they going to come to the west coast of the United States? Well, the first one is going to be the gold rush. In 1849, gold is going to be found in California, and this will begin the gold rush as people scramble out west in order to hopefully strike it rich and find some gold very quickly. There's a reason the San Francisco 49ers are called the 49ers. It's because the gold rush happened in 1849. But as people are moving out here, we need a way to get people out here. So there's going to be railroads that are built. So many Chinese immigrants are coming out to the west coast of the United States in order to get jobs in the railroad industry. Now, I do want to add this, and I didn't put it on here, and I should have, that most of these migrants are just men. They're either single men who really don't, they don't have a family holding them back in China, so they're coming over to the United States, or they are married men who are working on the railroad and sending money back home. Generally speaking, women and children are going to stay in China, and we'll talk about why that's important in a few slides. Let's talk about the U.S. response to it first. The U.S. response in 1882 is to have the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's pretty straightforward. It's going to prohibit and exclude all Chinese laborers. And that's what this picture is showing here. Now, this particular artist is taking a very negative view towards the Chinese Immigration Act because he's pointing out that, hey, all of us here are immigrants. We all came from somewhere else. And then the different parts of the wall have like jealousy and fear, law against race. Obviously taking a very negative view there. Now, the word that I use is coolies. Coolies is a racist and derogatory phrase and one that we are not supposed to use because it is so racist and derogatory. But I do want you guys to be aware of it. Coolies were people who, was the name for people who came from India or China or any other part of East Asia to the United States. Generally speaking, these coolies were the individuals who would work on the railroads. They were doing more manual labor. So once again, very racist and derogatory term, but it's important to at least be aware of that. As the gold begins to dwindle, competition increases, and so does animosity towards the Chinese. We still see this today as many, especially manual laborers in the United States, argue and debate about how individuals from Mexico are coming across the border and taking jobs from Americans. So this is new, and regardless of where you stand on the issue, that's not the point. The point is this idea of Americans complaining about immigrants taking their jobs is not something that's new. That's been a part of the American fabric for a while. The Chinese Exclusion Act gets an update in 1917 with the Asiatic Barred Zone, which once again is pretty straightforward. If you're from Asia, you are prevented from coming to the United States starting in 1917. There are some exceptions, like the Philippines. Obviously, as we looked at last class, the United States has control over the Philippines. So if you're from the Philippines, you can come to the United States. But this is going to ban individuals from China and Japan and India and other countries deemed Asiatic. You'll talk about these things more when you get to AP US history next year. This political cartoon summarizes and really shows the thinking during this particular time period. I know it's a little grotesque here, but I'll go ahead and point it out. So, this is supposed to be Uncle Sam representing the United States. On one side, you have Southeastern European immigrants or even Irish immigrants who are swallowing Uncle Sam on one side, and you have Chinese immigrants on the other side who are taking over Uncle Sam. So there is this big fear that the United States is going to be swallowed up and completely destroyed by foreigners. This is actually where I want to take a little bit of a pause. Oftentimes, I make very brief and quick mentions between history and the modern day, but I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about some of these things very, very quickly, and then we'll go ahead and move on in our notes. So, obviously, we see the connection to the modern day. We can compare the Chinese immigrants to Jews during World War II and to refugees from the Middle East today. All of them are leaving their home nations for very good reasons, usually because there's a war going on and there's a lot of violence. We also see the responses by these nations. Now, what I do want to point out is that these responses happen for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to sit here and say that social Darwinism and hatred of other people and nationalism isn't taking effect. It absolutely is. All of these responses probably include social Darwinism, and they include hatred of others, a bit of racism, a bit of hyper nationalism, almost jingoism as well. But what we also see is that one of the major reasons why the United States wants to close its borders to these foreigners is because they want to protect their culture. I'm not justifying the United States here. I'm not forgiving them either. But I would like to point out that the United States is not unique in doing this. We've already studied the Ming Dynasty. We saw the voyages of Zheng He, but as those voyages brought more and more foreigners into China, China said, no, we're closing our doors to foreigners. We also saw this with Japan. As more and more European foreigners came into Japan, Japan said, absolutely not. We're shutting ourselves off. We're going to establish the Tokugawa shogunate. So we see that this is a response to immigration. It's somewhat a natural response that all countries do, regardless of whether they're Western countries or non Western countries. What we're seeing today is we're seeing a rise in nationalism, both in the United States and in Britain and in other parts of the world as well. What I want you guys to realize here, and this is me trying to take the big picture on this, is history oftentimes acts like a pendulum. It's going to swing back and forth just like this. It may start in the middle, but once it reaches an extreme, it will come back down. For example, underneath the Mongol Empire, we started becoming more globalist. But then, as a global society, we became too globalist. The Ming Dynasty wanted to shut its doors, and so did the Japanese under the Tokugawa shogunate. So we started to swing back this way, away from globalism. But then we saw the nationalism movements in the Ottoman Empire and how all of those different cultures, like Serbia, wanted to break away from the Ottoman Empire. We saw the unification of Italy. We saw the unification of Germany. And so we start to get a more nationalist society. What we'll see in Unit 7 is that nationalism becomes so extreme that it starts the Great War, World War I. And after World War II, we'll start to see a swing back to globalism. We'll see the we'll see the United Nations. We'll see the World Health Organization. We'll see all these trade deals like NAFTA. But what we're witnessing right now, and maybe I'm totally wrong on this. It's very difficult to tell when you're kind of living through history here. Is I believe that we're starting to reach the peak of globalism. We're going to start swinging back to nationalism. What makes me think that are a few different things. One, the election of Donald Trump. Now, as I'm sitting here recording this, Joe Biden was just inaugurated today, so maybe that's going to reverse everything. I'm really unsure. But the election of Donald Trump clearly signaled that the United States was going to become more nationalist. The second big one is Brexit. We haven't really talked about Brexit much, but if you do know anything about Brexit, that's Britain leaving the European Union, and Britain wanting to be more nationalist. There's also been an increase of nationalism in many European countries and in Japan as well. So we're starting to see this swing away from globalism and back to nationalism. In order for us to really truly understand what we need to do as human beings in this society, we need to look at history. This is another opportunity for us to say that history isn't just facts, it isn't just dates, but it is truly replacing experience that we lack in order to make good decisions about our future. I'll go ahead and jump off my soapbox. Let's go ahead and go back to what we were talking about here. I said that when the Chinese immigrants came to the United States, they were mainly male, and that's going to have an impact on China. Well, the people who are left in China are mainly females. So the females have to step up and emerge and take over traditional male social roles. So they're going to be the ones doing traditional male jobs. This is a huge change for China. If we remember all the way back in Unit 1, we talked about how women were to be submissive to men under the Confucian ideology. That is starting to change, and we're going to see a bunch of change in China coming up pretty shortly in the next couple of units. Let's go ahead and shift our focus and talk about Australia. We have not talked about Australia, I think, at all in this class. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Australia originally starts as a penal colony, as a colony for prisoners. So the prisons in Britain are full and they need a place for those prisoners to go. So they banished them to this island starting in 1788. Well, it turns out that this massive island of Australia has a whole lot of resources like wool and copper and gold. And so the British say, well, hey, we should extract a lot of those resources. And they continue to do so. Eventually, in 1901, Australia is going to be independent. However, it's still going to identify as British. They still have the British flag on their flag, and their culture was very British-like. The people of Australia really identified with the British and really looked up to the British. That is up until about World War II. So we see at this time Australia really does act as an extension of the of Britain and of the British Empire. What we do need to realize here is that when the British showed up, they replaced and got rid of the Aborigine population that was already there. The Aborigines were, you can think of them as the Native Americans of Australia, the people who were already there. Just as we saw with American expansionism, Americans had better weapons and were able to take over the natives. We're going to see the same thing with the British. The British have better weapons because they're industrialized and they easily take over the Aborigine population that was already there. So this is once again a little bit of imperialism as well. What we do see starting in 1901, actually, I do want to tell a story here really quick. I used to work as an usher at Cashman Field back when the baseball team was there. So this is a couple of years back at this point. And we had a British individual, a British woman who would work there. Her name was Chris. We called her Chris the Brit. Very nice lady, huge Cardinals fan, if you happen to be from St. Louis. And she must have been like 60 or 70 years old, something along those lines, but a fabulously wonderful, very nice person. But she would escort people down to their seats. We had, weirdly enough, many Australians come to the ballpark. It turns out Las Vegas is a magnet for people from Australia. They love coming to Las Vegas. And since they don't have baseball in Australia, they love seeing baseball games. So Chris, the Brit, would always connect with these Australians. They would have so much that they could talk about because Australia really did act as an extension of Britain. Those things have changed a bit, especially since the 1950s, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But I just wanted to tell you the story and let you know, so that way you see a real life example. Now let's talk about white Australia. So in 1901, Australia at this point is independent, and they're responding to the immigration crisis that's occurring. You see, people from China are still leaving China. They're no longer allowed to come to the United States, so they want to go to somewhere else that has a lot of gold and a lot of jobs. Australia's got a lot of gold, and they're building railroads there, so they got a lot of jobs as well. So many Chinese and other Asiatic individuals start immigrating to Australia. Australia absolutely hates this because they see it as a destruction of their culture, and so they implement White Australia. It's not necessarily laws, more of a policy that prevents people of non-European origin or pretty much non-British origin from emigrating to Australia. Australia is going to encourage more and more. Yes, Australians are encourage more and more Europeans in order to emigrate to Australia to make sure they don't have to let in anyone who is Chinese or from India or anyone who is non-European. One piece of irony I would like to point out is this medal here. So this is a White Australia medal. This medal says Australia for the Australians, which I would like to point out that the Australians are the Aborigine people who were there in the first place, not the people of European descent who live in Australia. So this is highly ironic because these people are saying, look, our country should belong to the people who were originally here, except that they're not the ones who were originally there. I'll leave you with that piece of irony, and you figure that all out as well. Let's go ahead and jump to New Zealand, and this will be our last slide here. Yes, so New Zealand, just to the south of Australia there, acted as a settler colony. We talked about settler colonies when we looked at the French in Algeria. The French just sent a lot of people to Algeria, and they outnumbered the population. That's what happens in New Zealand. The British send a whole lot of people to New Zealand, and they outnumber the Maori population, which happens to be the original native population that was there. Now, there is a Maori rebellion. There is a rebellion against the British invaders, but it does not work out for the same reasons as before. The British are highly industrialized. The Maori are not. If we look at the 2013 census, we see that 74% of the population of New Zealand is European, and a majority of that would be British, compared to 15% of Maori or natives to the island of New Zealand. So we see that this settler colony is no joke. The British were sending many, many people over there. What I do want to point out is that once upon a time, maybe this was like a couple of years ago at this point, I was really bored. I was sitting at home and I wanted to watch something on TV. So I turn on the TV, and there's just nothing on. So I go to ESPN Plus, which I had got, and there's no football, there's no basketball, there's no baseball, there's no hockey, there's nothing on. There wasn't even soccer on either. The only thing that was on was cricket. It was between New Zealand and India. And I said, okay, I'm really bored, so I'm going to turn it on. So I'm watching the cricket game that takes place in New Zealand. And for those of you who don't know what cricket is, let's just pretend it's like baseball, but it's on a bigger field. Okay. And so I'm watching the cricket match, and I'm looking at the people in the crowd. And what I'm seeing is that the people in the crowd are all clearly of British descent. They're all very, very white. All of the people on the field for the New Zealand team are all British. They're all very, very white as well. This really hit home to me because this only could happen because New Zealand is a settler colony. There were no Maoris on the team. There were no Maoris in the crowd. It was all British people, which is it only occurs because it's a settler colony. So we do see that there are long-term effects here. Yes, the British started coming in the 1800s, but we still see the impact that it has on New Zealand today, both with the demographics and the culture that happens to be there. Because certainly the Maoris were not playing cricket. That was something that was introduced to them by the British. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to go ahead and wrap up our lecture there. As I said, we have one more lesson, but there's no lecture associated with it, so you won't have to watch anything else. Just make sure you have your notes and you are ready for class.